One of the ways the Prophet dealt with mistakes, sins, and errors is to show compassion. We are good at showing arrogance and hatred, but this does not mean you step on people like a cockroach. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. The Prophet, who was sent as a mercy to mankind, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his way was to be compassionate, kind, and tolerant, and to be understanding, yet whilst drawing the line. It was reported a man named Abdullah, and the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This one was a practical joker. He used to make the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam laugh. He had a good sense of humor, and sallallahu alaihi wasallam laughed at what he said and did. The companion had a huge deficiency, and his deficiency was that he sort of was addicted to drinking wine, and so many times he was brought up to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam intoxicated, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would flog him, the prescribed punishment for drinking and consuming intoxicants, and that had been repeated many times. One day he was brought forward, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam convicted him and sentenced him to be flogged. The guy makes me laugh, but this does not mean that I pardon him. The hadith of Osama ibn Zayd, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was angry, when he interceded and said, if my own daughter Fatima were to steal, this is something I mentioned before, I would have cut off her hand, as this is the prescribed punishment. So it shows the fairness of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even like considering who the individual was, he would still give them the prescribed punishment. As he was being flogged, one of the companions had enough, because he saw that he was brought so many times, so he started cursing him. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not curse him. O Prophet of Allah, he is committing a sin, he is one of the companions. The least we can do is do this to him, curse him and shame him. Do not curse him, for that he loves Allah and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I know nothing more, he loves Allah and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In another narration, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not assist Satan against your brother. When you're collaborating against him, then Satan would whisper in the ears. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not say this, rather say, oh Allah, forgive him and have mercy upon him. We learn from this hadith that though he is a sinner, though he's made a mistake, the origin of Islam is instilled in his heart. Is that brother is still a Muslim, and this should be at the back of our minds. People of mistakes, error, and sins do not leave the fold of Islam. We must not side with Satan and make him take action what could take him out the fold of Islam. The Prophet ﷺ said about a drunken, do not assist Satan against your brother. Number 12, asking the person to stop doing the wrong action. So when you see someone doing the wrong action, you tell them to stop doing it. And the ways vary. Sometimes it is public, indirect, private, but the main point is what is sinful needs to stop. It should not be tolerated and be continued. If it is possible, such mistake will not continue to exist, and something to replace it. The Prophet ﷺ once heard a companion swearing by his father. Doing so is shirk. We are not allowed to take oaths except by the name of Allah and his attributes. When the Prophet heard this, he said, stop. Then the Prophet explained why, and he said, one who swears with other than Allah's name, he has committed shirk. The Prophet told us how to stop the error and mistakes and replace it with something good. Also in the hadith, Abdullah ibn Busr, he is telling us about a man who crossed people's necks and shoulders, crossing the road trying to get to the first row. The Prophet said, sit, you have harmed the Muslims. So the Prophet interrupted his khutbah. Likewise, Ibn Umar says, a man burped in the presence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and lots of people laugh when people burp. They think this is indecent, but it is funny. It is totally sinful to laugh when someone passes wind, but in terms of burping, the Prophet heard this and rebuked the person who did it loudly and publicly without any shame, and said to him, refrain from burping, as it annoys us. For the longer people are with full stomach in this dunya, they will be the longest people that will be starving on the day on judgment. This tells us that we should not fill our stomachs too much and exaggerate when we eat. Also, the 13th point is explaining to the person making the mistake how to put things into perspective. You can always say this is wrong, but you need to also tell them how they can make things right. You have to direct the person that this is wrong, you have to do this. Sometimes the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam will sometimes bring notice to the person making the error individually, or to point out to him. If he does not understand, he may say it in a way that he would correct himself. The Prophet ﷺ once asked for intercession for one of the enemies of Islam, whom the Prophet ﷺ ordered the Muslims to kill. and in the conquest of Makkah he came with Uthman ibn Affan, and he interceded that the Prophet would spare him, though he did heinous things against the Muslim women, and said bad, awful things about the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ did not comment, and Uthman kept on interceding until the Prophet forgave him. When the man left, the Prophet said this to the companions: why would you not go and kill the man? The companions said, you could have winked at us and given us a sign. The Prophet ﷺ said, a prophet does not do such a thing. It is issues of deceit. This man was an enemy of Islam, and I did not comment when Uthman interceded. When you didn't do anything, Uthman asked me, I forgave the man. Also, part of asking the person to rectify his mistakes and try to explain that to him is to ask that individual to do something again, hoping he would correct it himself. And the man came to the Prophet ﷺ, while the Prophet was in the masjid, and he prayed the 2 rakats, and the Prophet was noticing the man without the man being aware. When he came to the Prophet and gave salam, the Prophet responded ﷺ, saying wa alaykum as-salam. The Prophet said, pray again. You did not pray. So the man went and prayed again in the same fashion, and then gave salam, and the Prophet ﷺ said again, go back and pray as you have not prayed. The Prophet was hoping that the man would figure out what was wrong with his prayer himself and not to repeat the mistake. The 3rd time the man prays and gives salam, the Prophet says, go back and pray. You have not prayed. The man raised the white flag. I surrender. I do not know how to pray. So the Prophet ﷺ here tells us what to do, that he should pray with tranquility and give each pillar its right, ruku and sujood. He corrected the man so he would avoid it. In another incident, if the mistake has already taken place and the Prophet ﷺ came to know about it, if it can be retracted and rectified, let's go for it. The Prophet ﷺ once was addressing the Muslims. It's not permissible for a woman who believes in Allah on the Day of Judgment to travel without the company of a male mahram. This is what the Prophet ﷺ said. A man stood up and said, O Prophet Allah, my name was drafted for fighting in the cause of Allah and for expedition, and my wife had to set off for Hajj. I'm in a dilemma. The Prophet ﷺ said, go and catch up with your wife and perform Hajj with your wife. Leave everything, which indicates that it can be rectified. It was narrated by Bukhari and Muslim and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. If you can rectify the error or the mistake, you must do this, as in the situation where the man came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, O Prophet of Allah, I have come to pledge allegiance to you and to do hijrah, but I have left my parents crying behind. In another narration, he came for fighting in the cause of Allah, to fight with the Prophet ﷺ, but he left his parents crying. The Prophet ﷺ said, go back and make your parents laugh as you made them cry. The parents have a huge status in your life. So when I said in another narration, he came for fighting in the cause of Allah, and the Prophet and he told the Prophet ﷺ he left his parents crying. He was telling us about the importance of the parents. Also, we have expiations, offering kafara for the mistakes. So sometimes we may fall into a mistake, error, or do a sin, but Allah does not block our way of redemption, but Allah gives us expiations to wipe off such mistakes or sins, such as expiation when you break an oath, you either kill someone by mistake, or when someone has intimacy with his wife during the daytime of Ramadan or so on. These expiations show and illustrate that Allah is the most merciful, as his names, beautiful names and attributes say, the most compassionate, and there is a way out to every mistake, but we must not block. So I'll leave you here. Fi manillah wa sallallahu wa baraka ala nabina Muhammad. Astaghfirullah. I'll catch you in the second last episode in the next video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.